Did you have any role models for journalists? Who did you look up to? Who did you want to be like?
Well, there was when I first got into it, there was a guy named Warren Hinkle, who was an editor primarily in San Francisco at various newspapers. He didn't last very long at any of them. He was a typical journalist. He had his own ideas about everything, and wasn't actually very interested in anybody else's. And so I liked him just because he didn't take any stuff. He just was there to do what he wanted to do, and the hell with everybody else. Which seems like more normal activity when you're in school in the San Francisco in the 60s. But the older I get in the biz, the more I come to appreciate the ability to do that, to just say, you don't like what I'm doing, tell them, fire me. And they would, and he went someplace else.
Had the free speech movement kicked in by that time, or is that before?
It had actually kicked in a couple of years earlier than that over in Berkeley. Mario Savio and those guys. And by the time it was actually going sort of around the Bay Area, the anti-war movement came in and kind of pushed it out of the way. And what was then happening for several years was Vietnam. The whole idea of it, the arguments against what was being done, and it was just that really, in my college newspaper career, that's really what was going on.
What did you cover? What was your beat?
Well, I started out actually doing entertainment news, but I quickly became sort of a jack of all trades at the newspaper. So I'd write about Bobby Kennedy showing up, and then a couple of issues later I'd write about Eldridge Cleaver. It was just whatever was going by that looked interesting to me. So I got to at least be at events where some pretty interesting people were there. And it was really, really the thing that launched me in this whole career, because, it was, as I said, it was just very interesting, and it was so varied, and I couldn't see myself punching a clock at a regular job, so this looked pretty good to me.
And this is back still during the hot type days and typewriters?
Oh, good Lord, yes. We used to run the paper out to Ocean Avenue, which was a fair piece from where the paper was, to the shop of a guy named Arnie Kleppel, who actually set the type and everything, and he had a I wouldn't say a drinking problem. Let's just say he liked to drink. And so it was not at all unusual that we'd show up to read the galleys. And Arnie wouldn't be there. So you'd go through it and you'd do the corrections and all the rest of that, and he still wasn't there. So then, his son, Little Arnie, as he was known, had to go to the Zanzibar, which was the closest watering hole to that, and dig him out of the bar to come and finish, put in the corrections and that kind of stuff. And he could barely walk when he got in there, but he could set type better than anybody I'd ever seen.
That's a real lost art, too.
Oh, yeah.
With those printers being able to, for those of you who don't know, the galleys, they ran them off, and so that's where you did your proofs and editing and the like. And back in the old days when hot type was still around, the linotype machines, those old printers could read that type, upside down, and it was a really amazing thing to kind of watch. What brought you to Alaska?
I was born here. I was actually born in Fairbanks.
What brought you back?
I could get a job You know, I spent a year after college looking for work in San Francisco and not finding any. So I went. I was going back and forth all the time. I'd go work in the summers, you know, in exotic places like Amchitka Island and that kind of thing. And I finally there was a pal of my father's who was the executive editor at the Times. And he said, yeah, come on and see me. And the job they had at that time, talk about the old days, the stories were punched in paper, long paper rolls. And so they needed somebody to tear them apart, you know, and put them on clips so that they'd be able to find stuff. That was my first job, was hanging type. And from there, you know, the one thing about the Times was it didn't pay all that great, so there was a lot of turnover, I guess is what I would say. So I was, from that job, within 18 months, I was the city editor of the newspaper. So
Where was the Times located then?
it was down on 4th Avenue. So essentially where it's now the court system took that office over. But it's 4th and, I was trying to remember this, 4th and L maybe? No, 4th and K? Yeah, 4th and K. And it was this sort of little building. And then for a while, they put a boxcar across the back of it and built a building where the Daily News was during the joint operating agreement. And, you know, it was just sort of the funkiest layout you could possibly imagine. The newsroom was on the first floor, and the guy who owned the paper, Bob Atwood, was on the second. And then his wife, Evangeline, had a room upstairs. God knows what else was there. I thought they cleaned out some paper rolls or something to give her that place. And so when I went to work there, the Anchorage Times was arguably the most pro-development newspaper that had ever been run. And when I got to be city editor, I was the one who decided what stories got done. And Mr. Atwood, nobody ever called him Bob, at least when I was doing that, had all these sort of pro-development stories he wanted done. And what he used to do is he'd type them on this green paper, which we soon came to call them green, what was it, green bolts or something like that, and run them down to the newsroom, and I'd get them. And when I thought it would make a decent story, I'd assign it and somebody'd go. But a lot of the times it didn't. So I'd take the bottom drawer of my desk and put the things in there. And I got to tell you, pretty quickly, I needed another drawer to store all those things. But the thing was that every once in a while, he'd remember something that was supposed to be in the paper and wasn't. So he'd call me up to his office, and we would have a free and frank discussion about what we were doing and what we weren't doing and why we weren't doing it, and how, damn it, if he said we were supposed to do it, I was supposed to do it. And I'd tell him, hey, this job's yours anytime you want it. And then we'd, talk about something else, and I'd leave, and we'd go back to doing that. And it was an interesting kind of relationship that I had with.
What were some of the types of stories that he wanted you to do?
They were almost all pro-development stories. He was a guy who thought that every ribbon cutting should be on a front page. That's just the kind of guy he was, and most of the reporters and editors had a completely different idea about what journalism was, which accounts for the fact that people like Mike Granberry didn't last very long.
Mike Granberry is a classmate of mine.
You know, he was there for, I think Mike might have been 2 winters, which was the standing record for some time there at the paper. And, you know, it just drove people nuts. And so they'd sort of cycle through there and cycle through there and cycle through there. They had some damn good reporters went through there and went on to much bigger jobs, but they just couldn't keep them because of the, you know, their concept of what the paper should be.
49 years ago this week, there was a huge earthquake. Were you here or California or up in Fairbanks?
I was up in Fairbanks. There are some people in the room who were here somewhere. Tim, where are you? Yeah.
I'm still shaking.
So no, I was up in Fairbanks, and it was strong enough that you could actually feel it there. But fortunately, you know, as I'm sure you've seen pictures, the place just got completely knocked around, but there actually wasn't that much, not that many deaths as a result of it. And, you know, so they sort of had to rebuild the town from the ground up. You know, all of this stuff we're in now was just muskeg, basically. There wasn't anything here at the time. And a lot of the city wasn't here either because it was before the oil boom actually hit here. But the part that was left, with the exception of, you know, parts of 4th Avenue, which just fell into the, you know, fell down the hill and they had to tear it up. Everybody just sort of shrugged and went back to building the place.
What's your favorite Bob Atwood story? What's your most memorable story about him?
I'd have to think about this because they were quite a lot of them. The best story I have is I was going upstairs, which is where he was, to do something. I don't even remember what it was. And he had an office. There was a secretary, and then there was his office. And when I got up the stairs, Bob Atwood was just nose to nose with somebody. And they were yelling just as loud as they could. And I thought to myself, you know, I was a little skinny guy. I wasn't going to get involved in that, but I thought, you know, maybe I should do something about that. And about the time I said that, and this is the God's honest truth, Atwood turned the guy around and kicked him down the stairs. And I thought, maybe I better reevaluate my how I dealt with him.
What was Mrs. Atwood like?
She was really a sweet woman. One of the reasons I got the job I got, and kept it certainly, is that she had been my mother's Sunday school teacher in Skagway, which gave me some, even though I wasn't a religious man, gave me some purchase on it. Yeah. But she would sort of report for duty every day. I mean, she'd go up to her office. She was writing a book about, I think it was called Who's Who in Alaska. And I always went up to talk to her just because she was a nice person to talk to. You know, I'd go up and sit down and sort of we'd start chatting and I'd say something, you know, about Bob and she'd say, oh, don't pay any attention to him, you know. You know, if there's a problem, I'll take care of it. And she was actually quite a force in Anchorage. She started the League of Women Voters and, oh, geez, there was a couple others.
World Affairs Council?
World Affairs Council. And like the Women's Club, I think it was, something like that. So she wasn't just, you know, sitting at home, you know, getting dinner ready.
Do you think he was as still interested in owning a newspaper after statehood as he was before statehood?
I think it wasn't as much fun for him. You know, it was, at that time, everybody who was involved in that was really sort of, at the same time, they were jazzed and determined. You know, they really thought that they had an issue that they wanted to see succeed, and they were willing to do a lot of things that you wouldn't normally expect people to do. You know, they get on the airplane, fly all the way to D.C., and, you know, lobby, and they'd you know, make flights to Seattle to talk to Henry Jackson, who was the guy who actually shepherded the Statehood Act through the Senate. And, you know, they really believed in getting local control of all of these things that the federal government had had for so long. And they worked really hard. They had a constitutional convention in 1955, which my father was a member of, in which they wrote the laws of the state of Alaska from scratch in 55 days. And they just, every chance they had, they pushed. And when they got it, it was like a lot of them just didn't know what to do next. You know, certainly there were a lot of them who thought that this was the most important thing that they'd do in their lifetimes. You know, and so it was
sort of hard to top.
Yeah, but it was sort of a come down. You know, it was like, you know, okay, now what do we do? You know, and most of the people who took over the government at the time hadn't been big players in the whole statehood thing. It was a different group, and so it was just a victory and a defeat at the same time.
Mm-hmm. What led you to column writing? How did you get that gig?
I was working at the Daily News. I was the city editor, the assistant city editor, actually. And there were two columnists. One was Susan Nightingale, who left, I think, because she got pregnant. Couldn't do it. And wanted to spend some time with her new baby. And the other was a guy named Satch Carlson, who ran afoul of, he was a teacher as well as a columnist, ran afoul of the problem that he created for himself by sleeping with one of his students. So just like that, there wasn't an editor. And so my entire job interview, Howard Weaver, who was the editor at the time, came out into the newsroom where I was working, and came over and he said, "Hey, you want to be a columnist?" I said, "Sure." He said, "You are." And that was it.
Was it tough for you to leave newspapers?
It was. You know, I mean, it wasn't a great job every day, but in terms of, you know, sort of the things you learned and the kind of life you were able to lead, and the chance that you had to, if not affect history, at least to chronicleize it, was, I just don't know how else you could have done it. On the other hand, it was getting pretty monotonous by then. And I was actually ready to do something else. You know, I always tell people, and it's absolutely true, it's the greatest job I ever had, and I was perfectly happy to leave it.
As a legislator, being interviewed by people and covered by a lot of people, how did your perspective about newspapers or journalism change? Or what perspective did you have that was different?
Well, I'm not sure that my attitude about newspapers changed. Newspapers changed. You know, they got to be much more cost conscious, and, you know, frankly, they laid off reporters left and right. And the thing is, you'll notice it on TV now. You know, if you're watching Channel 2 News, which is really the only decent news TV program, that you see new faces all the time. They're just constantly moving out or moving up or what it is they're doing. But a lot of that is just because they won't pay people enough to stay. So I don't really see that the job that I had in the legislature was that much different than the job as I had as a columnist. And there wasn't really any other game in town, frankly. So I think that if you talk to the people who covered the legislature when I was working there, they'd sort of say the same thing, I wasn't there to impress anybody.
Did you ever run into a situation where you knew that if you were the journalist interviewing the legislator, there was a question that should have been asked but wasn't asked, and you were dying to give the reporter the hint? Gosh, he should have been asking me this. He should have been asking me that.
It used to drive me nuts. Just drive me nuts. And so on occasion I'd go back to whoever the reporter was and say, well, this is the information that you might have gotten if you'd gone about it this way. Of course, they hated that. They just hated that. And I was doing it the day I walked out of the business, the House of Representatives, I guess it was. But, all it did actually was frustrate me and probably make them mad, because who wants anybody sort of looking over their shoulder all the time?
What does it mean to be a journalist today?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Things have changed so much and so rapidly in the last, 10 years, that the idea of journalism is much different now. Think about it this way. When you were in the newspaper business, you'd go out, say you were working for a morning paper. You'd go out, you'd get your information, you'd go back, you'd do your story. It would go through whatever process it was, even when it was computers. And then it would get printed and put on trucks and trucked to wherever it was and thrown out or whatever it would be, and it land on your doorstep. It's a process that took about 8 hours from start to finish. Well, then television came along, and you did the same kinds of stuff, except the process of delivering the paper didn't happen anymore, right? You turned on your TV set and it was there, right? So it was, to use this example, 8 hours fresher. Now, there's a story, it gets on the internet like that and is available to anybody who wants to look. So now, I wouldn't say it's actually instantaneous, but it's pretty close. And it's changed the business for those reasons, as well as sort of commercial reasons, which are a slightly different thing. But really, it's the technology and the delivery of the information as a result of that technology that's changed, the news business.
Are there any guiding principles that were true when you were starting that are still true today, that make you a journalist as opposed to something else, a blogger, or a columnist, an editorial writer? Or?
Well, I know this is going to sound sappy, but truth is important in a way, excuse me, that I don't think is important necessarily on the internet. And the fact that something can be verified is important as well, that it's not just going to be something that gets said and goes away and you never see it again. So there are, those kinds of things, sort of the big things, and then there's the little things. When you are learning the newspaper business, they talk about who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? That those are the questions that you should ask and answer. But when you're looking at what's being put on the net, they very often don't have those kinds of questions answered. What you get instead is whatever looks and sounds good and can be delivered fast. Those are the characteristics that they use now. And so in that sense, it's a much different business than it was when I was in it.
What's the what are some of the things that you talk about in your class? How do you draw the distinctions between when you're writing a column and the kinds of columns that are written about today that are on the internet? What are some of the issues that come up?
Well, I've been teaching in a section on blogs, but actually probably half the students that are in my class know more about it than I do. But I have been talking to them about how do you account for the fact that getting information out of the internet is like trying to get a drink of water from a fire hose. So what do you use? What are the kinds of things that you use, both in terms of developing information and using it? Blogs are actually, stripped to their basics, are just a way to deliver information. And the question becomes, okay, what standards do you have? If you're in the journalism business, you probably got different standards than if you're, just putting something on Facebook for your friends. But if you're going to do what I've been doing my entire life, and what perhaps some of the people out here who have been and may be doing in the future, you have to have that sort of situation in which you can verify things. The only other way to do it is to, you can shop the other news outlets, right? You can look at sort of the left-wing and right-wing stuff that's on the net. Somebody once described it as adding up all the lies and dividing by 2. So you have access to information there. It's just hard to tell how good the information is.
Do you think if you were a careful reader of all that information, you could discern what the truth was?
I'm not sure anybody ever knows what the truth is. Pursuing the truth is an avocation that many people spend their whole lives trying to follow, and will admit at the end of it that they didn't catch it. You can hope to get, and sometimes do get, some of the elements of truth, but I wouldn't begin to tell one of my students how to find it or what it would look like when they found it. All I can do is talk to them about, how to pursue it. What's the best way to pursue it? And that's all I try and do.
One of the things that, if you're in our industry, the Pew Center comes out with an annual report on the state of the media, and I was looking at it this morning. 10 years ago, this was not in the Pew report, but this is just some context. 10 years ago, McClatchy was trading at $54 a share, and now it's below $3. It has been below $5 for about 5 or 6 years. The New York Times was trading at $44 and change. Now it's down to $9.80 and some change. Newspaper revenues were $44 million. Now they're down to $19 million. There were more than 56,000 newsroom employees in '89. Now it's down below 40,000. In 1999, 18 to 35-year-olds, 40% of them said that they'd read the newspaper yesterday. That's down below 20% today. 35 to 45-year-olds, which are really the sweet spot if you're a newspaper publisher, because those are the ones that buy homes and new cars and shop at the big box stores and get into the classifieds. In 1995, 50% of 35 to 45-year-olds said they read the paper. And in 2012, it's below 30%. And that's the trend line. So looking at those trend lines in your own crystal ball, what does that portend for newspapers, and what does that portend for the daily news?
Well, as I've said before, the problem, I mean, part of the problem, some of the problem is they can reach the same advertisers much more cheaply, and that's always going to hurt you. But a big part of the problem is just the time lag. And so there's nothing you can do about that. You might end up with 3 actual newspapers in the whole country. And, you know, there may continue to be, you know, weeklies that, you know, cover the corn crop report and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure that we're going to get those kinds of, you know, systems, that system is going to last very much longer. Could be wrong, but you know, the statistics you cited seem to reinforce the idea that we're on the downhill slope of that problem. On the other hand, Mark Twain once said that you can always work at a newspaper in hell because the people on the right side of hell would want to know what the people on the left side of hell were up to. You know, so there's going to be some system. Do I know what it is? I'm not in the prognostication business. Certainly not on something like this.
So you could see a time in your lifetime when there's not a newspaper here?
Mm-hmm. I can. You know, and frankly, I would be surprised if there isn't. When I was at the heart of the newspaper war, I was the city editor for 32 reporters in various places and on various beats. Now they have 7 reporters in the whole place. That's not an encouraging sign, you know, and would it go below that? Every time I talk to one of my old buddies there's a lot of talk about how this is the year that'll turn around. Well, that's been saying a lot for a long time, and it hasn't turned around.
Do you remember that when you were exposed to the internet?
Yeah, I think I do.
What happened?
What happened for me was what was I on? I think I was using like an old K-Pro 4 or something, and I was trying to get a specific piece of information. I can't tell you today what it was. And I had the problems that you had then. It wasn't that there was too much stuff there. The problem was that the technology of the delivery system was really bad. And, you know, I thought to myself at the time, but unless they figure out how to do this, I'm going to take that thing and put it in the museum, and that's going to be the end of it. But it turned out that there were thousands of people who were interested in improving that, who were using it for other reasons, for, you know, being able to sit in their PJs, you know, and you know, write whatever they wanted and, you know, sort of throw it out there and see who bit. So it's a complete technological change in the time since I started with computers. And at the rate that it's increasing, you know, they keep saying, well, there's going to be some place where you can't get any more bits faster than that. And 2 days later, somebody will announce something that does it.
What's public affairs or civics going to be like in a town without a newspaper? What happens when a newspaper dies? What happens to the town?
It closes up. Your ability to get information on the city council or a trial or whatever it is you might want to get out of it doesn't disappear. You can go and do it yourself, but your ability to get it easily disappears. And it disappears despite the internet because, it's hard to find the information that you're looking for there because all this other stuff is flying by you. And even if you can get it, even if, somebody says something about the cost of, I don't know, pencils, right? Then you got to go find out what the information is about pencils, right? And if there's a gazillion things about pencils, you got to sort through it. Nobody that I know who's just trying to get information sort of casually is going to stick with that very much. So unless you have a really good system for sorting information yourself, you're not going to be able to do that. And the problem is you're not sure what information to sort to begin with.
I wonder if we can Pal, is it okay to open it up to questions from the floor? Yeah. Okay. Why don't we take some questions from our guests, our friends? Come on, you're bound to have some questions for, yeah.
Papers like Juno, Empire, and the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, are they healthier than the Anchorage Daily News, those smaller papers?
Yes, in one way. The Daily News decided, I forget, it was like a week before the recession hit, that they signed agreements to buy a bunch of newspapers, the one in Minneapolis and I think...
McClatchy, you're speaking.
Yeah, sorry, McClatchy. Anyway, a bunch of pretty big papers. And, of course, the economy went gunny-sack, and they were left with not much production in terms of money and a lot of debt service. So what happened was they tried to, and were successful, I think, in a couple of places, is selling the papers back, although I don't think they got a premium for them because of the situation they were in. And otherwise just cutting the crap out of their news operations because it was an easy place to save money at that point. It's not the same thing with either of the other newspapers. Their financial situations are better. They're both owned by chains. And, the chains were more tight-fisted at the time where it paid to do that. But, if you ask questions about the quality, that's a different question. But I think they're doing pretty well. And as a matter of fact, I think the News Miner is probably pound for pound at least as good a paper as the Daily News is now.
Others?
I've been a long-time reader of ADM, and I see them moving as much as they can into the electronic format. And don't you think it's possible that the print newspaper might completely evolve here in Anchorage into an electronic newspaper? And how would that affect truth and verification? Well, the problem with electronic newspapers is nobody's really figured out a way to get them to pay enough to keep them in business. The Daily News is now trying to charge you, I guess what you do is you get a subscription, an electronic subscription, and then you can use it. And the New York Times has been moving some significant part of their production into the electronic side of it too. But like I say, nobody's been able to figure out a way to make sure that they're going to get their bills paid at the end of the month with electronic information. And until that happens, you're not going to, I mean, it is right now far more likely that newspapers are going to die than that they're going to transmogrify themselves into electronic newspapers. It's a, you know, in addition to everything else, it's a hell of an investment. You know, you got to buy all those machines, you know, and it's, you know, it just doesn't look likely to me that that's going to happen. Uh-oh.
Could you talk a little bit about the lack of institutional memory with all of the new young reporters that are coming?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's analogous to the legislature. What you have is a situation in the legislature where people turn over a lot. And there'll be a couple of people who've been there fairly sort of a long time, and they know a little bit of stuff. But the legislators are turning over, the bureaucrats are turning over, and so the institutional memory is lobbyists. They're the ones who've been there the longest and are, you know, just know more about it. That's not a particularly good situation for democracy, I don't think. Nor is it a particularly good situation for news if what you have is you're running people through who have to be retrained all the time. So your pool of reporters never improves its understanding of the place that they're reporting on because they just don't stay there long enough. And so, you know, if you watch closely, what you'll see is the same stories getting cycled through all the time because they're easy to get and easy to put in whatever medium it is you're dealing with. If you get anything that's got any depth to it, you just don't have that many people who can do anything with it. I mean, it's particularly, and I'm not trying to run down Channel 2 particularly, but it's particularly true when you watch them. They run a new cadre through every single one of them, except the anchors. A year maybe, something like that. You know, so if you don't have any institutional memory, you can't ever get ahead of the game enough to move from pretty superficial reporting to anything with any kind of depth.
Kathleen?
I think this is a question just to make me feel better. But partly because...
Yes, the paper was better when you were there.
I'm really going to invite Mike to fantasize a little bit here and imagine that you're back in the newsroom and you have plenty of reporters to work with. I would just love to hear the assignments you would make right now in Alaska. Maybe 3 of them. What would you be having to report to John?
Well, I think the first thing I would do, considering what I was doing recently, is I'd get a couple of them and just send them to Juneau and tell them, don't worry about what bill moved or you know, what speech was given on the floor. Just go find, you know, what is it? Find, Stephanie Salter said, it's not my job to figure out the big issues of life. My job is to look at things that look bad and say, oh, creepy, you know. And so I'd get a couple of people whose job was to do that, look at things and say, oh, creepy. The second thing I think I do is spend a lot more effort on the oil companies, because the only time you read anything about them is, at situations like ConocoPhillips donates a building or something like that. That's all to the good, but there's no information from inside those companies about what's going on there. So you run into all kinds of weird situations in which you think this is going on, turns out that was going on, and by the time you catch up to it, it's already done. And I don't know that there's anybody reporting on the oil companies in the entire state. Biggest industry in Alaska, and there's not a single reporter looking at them, which is just amazing to me, and not in a good way. And the third thing I think I would do is to sort of have somebody whose job was to work on the changing demographics of Anchorage. Everybody talks about how diverse the population is now and all the rest of that, but they don't tell you anything about it. You don't know. Somebody says, well, there are a lot of, Martians in the assembly or in the town now, and nobody reports on the Martians. You don't know if they've got one head or two heads or three heads or anything like that. This is maybe as important, and probably over the long term more important than any of the other stuff. So that's what I'd do. Yeah.
I got a slight spin up on that, which is you've been around journalism in Alaska now for 40 years, pretty close, and you're familiar with the definition of, sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I know. Definition of journalism is the rough first draft of history. So the question is, what do you think we've missed? What are the biggest things in this sweep of change and time that we've seen over the last 40 years with the pipeline and everything that flowed out of it, that we kind of missed in that rough first draft?
Well, the native corporations, certainly. Everybody knows that there are some. Somebody can probably name two or three of them. And every once in a while you get a story about one of them buying a hotel or something in the lower 48. But there's been a tremendous change in the business that native corporations do since, the land claim settlement in 71. And there's almost nothing on it in there, nothing. If it's if it's just the first rough draft of history, there's a blank where that rough draft ought to be, and it shouldn't be like that. I don't think. So there's that. There's, I'd say, maybe violent crime, some kinds of violent crime. We've now started relatively recently to trying to figure out about, how much rape there is and what can be done about it, but we're not really very close to that at all. And, if there has been any in-depth look at that, I don't know about it. Somebody might have done it, I just didn't see it. That's entirely possible. But, you're living in a state with some of the, the highest per capita rape statistics in the United States anyway, and maybe in the world. But nobody's really coming to grips with that overall. You got organizations that are dealing with it, and they're giving them money and doing that, but nobody is really trying to write about why this is happening and what's happening to it and what could actually be done to lower the rates, which is, statistically not happening. So, that seems to me to be a big hole in whatever you're trying to say about Alaska now, or even in the past. Hell, when I got into the journalism business, it wasn't even reported. So we're at least that far along, but we just haven't moved very fast. So it's things like that. It's not necessarily numbers or some legislator's idea for a super new something, which will cost us $8 billion and not do a damn thing. It's these things that are right in front of us that we just don't see, or we don't see in the right way to deal with them properly.
Paula?
I wanted to ask both of you, you both have taught young people, what do you tell them about their prospects in journalism and public communications?
You get to go first on that.
I tell them some of the things that I would have told them 25 years ago, which is I do think there's a set of principles that distinguish at least contemporary journalism and journalists from everything else that may be portrayed as journalism, and we talk a lot about what those are. I talk a lot about assessing their own levels of curiosity. Are they curious about the world, and how do they want to go about investigating it? And whether it's about oil companies or music or architecture, or whatever it is, if there's no level of curiosity that's pretty intense, then I'm not sure that is a good sign. I've always thought that that knowing another language was important because it taught you a lot about other people's cultures and it gave you a better command of English. I say, despite some of the quizzical looks that I get in response, that they ought to take some classes in business because journalists write about money and have very little understanding of it. And the fourth thing I talk about, which is something I wouldn't have talked about years ago, is that I think people going into the field today have to be entrepreneurial. Whereas when I got out of college, you could get a pretty decent job. And if you were pretty good at it, you could get an even better job at some point. And your survival skills allowed for you to sort of move up. Or you could just stay wherever you were and have a pretty successful career. But I don't think being industrious is enough to punch your ticket today. I think you have to be very entrepreneurial, whether that's really fully taken advantage of or exercised. I think you have to, if you don't have that instinct, I think you have to develop it because the mobility of journalists is going to be greater in the future. It's good, even more so. So at one point, if you're going to think about your career, I think you have to think about the different types of tools that you have in your toolbox and how to use them in entrepreneurial kinds of ways. And I don't know that I would have said that certainly 20 years ago.
I had a pal of mine in the legislature named Harry Crawford, and whenever we got to the point where you sit in what they call a caucus meeting and everybody is trying to talk about a specific issue, and the thing just takes off and goes around and nobody's really got any idea if you're getting anywhere, and if so, where you're getting. And Harry always used to stop the conversation and say, what do you want to have happen? That's the real question, I think, for people who are thinking about going into journalism. What do you want to have happen? Do you want to make $1 million? Well, you're in the wrong racket. Go do something else. Do you want to, set things up so that you can, build up a group of advocates or whatever it was who would pay you a little bit, all of you, and you provide them with the information that they're interested in. Do you want to try to, work your way up the old way, which you can still do, although it's much harder. Start at a weekly and, go to a regional paper and then try and get up higher and then, get to the New York Times or wherever the hot spot is at that time and get a job there. But the first thing you have to have is a goal, right? And my experience with today's students is they're not going anywhere. They're just, they're interested in what they're doing, they're having a lot of fun, but when you try to get them to tell you what the future is like for them, you can't get them to say anything, because they haven't had enough experience to sort things out to be able to make distinctions and make decisions. So the first thing, the thing I would tell them is, look, what do you want to have happen? You want to get this job? Are you on a track to get it? What else do you have to do to get it? And get them to, and that's what I'm trying with my students. I just say, look, tell me what it is you want to have happen. Think about it. Tell me what it is. Work through it. Don't give me, something that's that much of it, because that doesn't get us anywhere. And if I get out of this situation that I've gotten myself in, and having told the students anything more than that appears to have stuck, I'll be satisfied with what I've done.
I have kind of a two-part question for you, Mike. What are you reading, and what are you going to be writing next?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not reading that much because, two reasons. One is that I turned out this job it was much more demanding than I thought it was going to be. But the other is I don't see as well. And so, I just I'm not spending as much time reading as I used to. And I don't know that I'm going to be writing anything else. I can't find letters is what the problem is. And so I've got this program, which I haven't worked all the way through, called Dragon Dictation. And the theory is I can sit down and talk something. And if that turns out to be true, then I'm going to write two things. I'm going to write more mysteries, and then I'm going to also try to write in a completely different vein about what it's like to be alive here and now. What we would call serious literature, I guess. And if one of those things works, I'll be satisfied, and if two work, I'll be amazed.
Maybe one last question.
Josh?
I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the future of rural and bush reporting with newsrooms shrinking and the demise of Alaska newspapers and just kind of less boots on the ground and people reporting more from a desk than actually being in those communities.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Essentially, those have been killed by profit motives because there's just not as much money in it as there used to be. They've got the same problem as any paper in Alaska, which is expenditures exceed revenues in a lot of places, and that's what's caused all those to sort of dry up. But here again, I'd say that really what's important here is information exchange, not the mechanism that you use to do it. And things like, radio and television have gotten a lot better in rural Alaska, just in terms of the quality of it, just the physical part of it, and its depth across the board. If somebody could figure out a way to deliver the news, I guess it would be by the internet. I'm not sure how else that would work. But if somebody who could figure out a way to package information and put it through the internet, you know, not only would it make information more widespread, it might make you enough money to keep doing it. You know, this is all just experimental at this point, so who knows? But
Well, thanks to all of you for coming out and being with us tonight. And just very quickly, it was a great opportunity for me to be the Atwood here. And since being the Atwood, I've taught a number of classes and still am active on the campus and enjoy it very much and really appreciate the opportunity to be involved in the campus and the university and the department and the work that Pal and others are doing. And Mike's been good enough to lend some of his muscle behind some of the fundraising efforts that are underway to really fully endow the chair. At one time it was a one-year program, and now it's a one-term program, and we'd like to boost it back up to a full term. And my wife Suzanne and I have contributed to it, and I know that maybe some of you have been able to, but if you haven't, and you want to take part and make an investment in journalism here in campus and in the city and the university and your community, I hope you'll think about that at some point. Mike, thanks. Yeah.
you bet. I just want to add this. If you know anybody who would benefit from having their chain pulled on this issue, come see me, because I'm perfectly happy to pull their chain.
Yeah, thanks.